There's only one viable jungle build and it makes the jungle meta absolutely terrible. Ahoy, my name is ZiSotto and after this bold statement we're going to dive a little bit into jungle items today. I think there have been some very interesting changes to jungle items at the start of the season with the new starters being introduced, but things went a little bit awkward from there and I want to explain that and I want to discuss what can be done about this. In order to do that, let's have a look at our options at the moment. We have Manikin Scepter, Eye of the Jungle, and Bumba's Dagger. Now, technically, you could think outside the box here and, for example, go for Bluestone, which works on a few junglers kind of-ish, but that's already the exception, I would say, and I wouldn't use it in most matches because it comes with significant downsides, and pretty much every other starter is very, very hard to make any use of in jungle at all, and it comes with significant downsides. So you're kind of restricted to the ones that were designed for jungle because they give you extra clear against jungle camps, they give you sustain from jungle, so really avoiding them is almost more effort than it's worth it. The least popular one of the three is Manikin Scepter. Manikin Scepter only gives you a little bit of a basic attack damage from the beginning of the game, a little bit of physical protection, and then gives you extra damage on your basic attacks as well as a tiny bit of sustain. We're talking 15 health and mana on targets that are affected by the burn. Now let me quickly demonstrate some issues with that. If you're using abilities while clearing camps, which you probably are, you may end up killing some of the small minions without having the burn applied to them. Sometimes it even seems that certain abilities don't recognize that the burn is on the target and you still don't get any health back. So in many situations where you're not exclusively clearing with basic attacks and having the dot up at all times, you may end up actually not even getting the heal. So the sustain of this item for the vast majority of characters is incredibly low, much lower than both of the other jungle starters. The aggression potential is in my opinion also very limited, since the starter here comes with some defensive stats along with offensive stats, meaning you don't really have the attack speed or the damage, ability damage behind it to make this work very well for early aggression. There are some exceptions that can potentially use it somewhat, like Arachne and Erlang Shen, who have very hard different ways of locking down or have self-sustain. Maybe, big maybe, but they are kind of bad users of it as well. And the upgrades are kind of similar in a way. They come with a weird mix of defensive stats, providing damage reduction and physical protection, as well as health in Manikin Mace's case, which doesn't really make sense given that the item is meant to be such an early aggression build-up item. Why would you suddenly want to switch into half defense, half aggression? And they also both provide basic attack damage. So these upgrades are essentially completely useless for any ability-focused assassin or any ability-focused jungler, because you have to have strong basic attack damage to make this work. In the case of Manikin Mace, you apply some additional damage over time to targets, but the damage from that isn't insane. It's less than Kinsai, for example, and it doesn't come with many stats to supplement that. It's actually more interesting for hunters, in my opinion, than it is for junglers, because at least they can apply that same amount of damage from range. It's not restricted by the range you're using it from. It does provide some increase in jungle camp clear, but we'll talk about that particular effect in a little bit anyways. And then Manikin Hidden Blade has this interesting component of having 15% of the target's current health as physical bonus damage and a 5-second slow, which could technically make it interesting for some characters if it wasn't tied to the fact that it also comes with 75 basic attack damage, making it a really weird item on ability-based characters that would utilize this burst well. Basic attack focused characters like Bakasura and Kali have enough late game DPS that burst is not their focus, so bursters are gods like Thor or Thanatos, and they typically don't get enough out of the basic attack damage and need other stats to make their burst work. They need penetration, they need power, they need everything that gives them a heavier hit and then some CDR along with that to use their abilities more often. So they would really not opt into this most of the time unless the tier 1 was very appealing and the bonus damage here was very appealing. But since you actually have to aggress yourself first, otherwise the effect is lost. So if you take damage, the effect is lost. This is a very questionable item overall. But the other starters or their upgrades are more interesting. Eye of the Jungle actually comes with a pretty solid mix of stats with some power, some HP 5 and some attack speed, and then additional HP 5 and MP 5 while in the jungle, which far outweighs the sustain that you can get from Mannequins. I still find that it feels kind of necessary to build into some pots in early game in order to get the sustain on the very early stages of the game, but after that you should be okay for the most part. And the stats of this item have already been significantly nerfed, especially because it was picked up in other roles as well. But I do think that it's still a decent early aggression choice because you have that extra attack speed, which on some guards just works very well. And this makes it so much more appealing than mannequins as well, because you just have extra attack speed in combination with extra power. So you hit faster, your abilities hit harder, and your basic attacks still hit as hard just without the dot. And since the dot values are kind of scaled to them being utilized too well in boxing, they aren't really that strong for gank anymore. It's not really enough damage to offset the other extra stats in my opinion. You basically just have to look at the enemy's item once and know that you shouldn't box them on level 2, and that's about it. The first upgrade of Eye of the Jungle is Seer of the Jungle, and that comes with a weird mix of stats that are actually significantly lower than the other upgrade for some reason, and then allows you to clear out wards and deal increased damage to jungle monsters and jungle bosses. I don't want to talk about this effect here yet, because we'll get to that with Bumba's Spear anyways. So, not really an interesting option for pretty much anyone either. The more interesting option here is Protector of the Jungle. Protector of the Jungle stat-wise is actually a solid option. 55 physical power or 80 magical power, plus 35 physical protection and 25% attack speed, as well as an additional 12% power and protections in the jungle. Now don't get me wrong, this is a good item with an interesting passive. It may very well be a balanced jungle item now. It used to have 65 power though, instead of 55, and it used to have 100 magical power instead of 80, as well as 35% attack speed instead of 25. So there were pretty significant nerfs to this item in a single patch in 8.3 that hit the entire stat block on this item. Now if you're playing a basic attack focused assassin, this is still likely the option you want to go for. But the big selling point of the high stats on it isn't really there anymore. It's not particularly better than many other items in the game, especially in situations where you are not in the jungle, where you're not using that extra passive. Outside of the jungle, this would literally be worse than an archival when you're looking at a direct boxing match with someone. And it's not every game that you're after physical defense on a basic attacker. And that brings up the question if playing guards that utilize Protector of the Jungle better is even the right choice. There are some exceptions, some guards just perform particularly well in this meta like Nemesis, who can work well with this item, but even she has an alternative. And the alternative comes in form of Bumba's Dagger. Now Bumba's Dagger is by far the most boring starter you could think of. 50 mana, 50 health, and then you get some extra basic attack and ability damage against jungle monsters, and you get a health restore. The big benefit of this item, it only costs 600 gold, so you can start with tier 2 boots, which is massive for some characters. And this is the reason why, in my opinion, Eye of the Jungle still has a presence in the first place, because the tier 1 of Bumba's is just so horrible. It is just a super lame sustain item and it doesn't really offer you anything else, which means if you're building into Eye or even Manikin, you can box someone very well for the first few levels, which in a ranked setting, for example, can be useful. But looking at the upgrades, you have Bumba's Spear, and I've mentioned this before with the others. This item gives you some power, some health, some mana for some reason, and then gives you extra damage against jungle camps and jungle bosses, and some extra sustain that I think still doesn't even work properly, where you're supposed to be healed for all of them and some of them still don't heal you. So what I can say about all of these items that provide massive damage against objective is nobody really cares. People that play Smite don't play Smite to deal a lot of damage to objectives. They play it for the competitive aspect, for the PvP aspect. That's why we have so many arena players as well. And when they play Conquest, they want to play strategical, but that doesn't mean that they want to focus their whole gameplay around playing objectives. You may have some exceptions in split push, Loki, Apollo, Bastet players, but even they wouldn't want to do objectives like Fire Giant or stuff where this really matters. They would want to split push their small objectives on the side. And it's not fun. It's not encouraging to build into that. You're just standing like, wow, I do a bigger number to a thing that just stands around and it's barely a challenge anyways. You're much better off just dealing a little bit more damage to your enemies, hitting them a bit harder, and then taking the objective after you've taken one of the enemies down completely. And people were thinking initially that maybe these items will be used more in competitive, but so far I doubt it. Even in competitive, one fight can decide so much, so you want to have as much potential as possible for every fight. And sneaking objectives maybe happen if an entire comp is built around it with leader's call and all that stuff, but so far I'm not seeing it, which means all of these items, actually 2 to 3 items that we currently have in the jungle builds, are just not worth building for almost anyone and definitely not fun to build, so there's no incentive to build them. And that leaves us with one item only, and that's Bumba's hammer. But I'm saying we only have one build, so there's more to it than just saying everyone's building Bumba's hammer. That's pretty obvious. So, Bumba's hammer comes with 300 health, 200 mana, 10% penetration, 20% cooldown reduction. Super weird mix of stats, because it means you kind of have to hold back on cooldown reduction until late game or trade something out. You also get a lot of survivability on an item that, I don't know, is kind of a damage item at the same time. And then it's interesting that this one provides penetration as well, I don't know, for some reason. But the big deal, of course, is the passive basically being Hydra's Lament on steroids. Every time you use an ability, your next basic attack deals 80 true damage to the target, and also heals you for 5% of your maximum health, and also reduces all your active cooldowns by 1 second. This item is insanely good. This item is so good that even solo laners are running it in order to get more sustain in late game and get all the other beneficial stats that you get from this. At the same time, this item is super awkward. This is the only real choice that ability-based junglers have at the moment. Everything else is super awkward to fit into an ability-based build. At the same time, this is a defensive item in many ways. So even pro players recommend to sell your starter on certain junglers, like Bastet, because they don't utilize Bumbas well enough and all the other starters barely feel worth it. And I think that's really weird. We have 2 starters that are laid out as basic attack focused starters, and one starter that has one option that is for ability based characters that already forces you to go into a more passive farming playstyle in early game, which is not what ability based junglers want, and then also forces you into a build that utilizes the passive of this item well. Which is extremely boring when you think about it, because what works well with a lot of health and returning health is some extra defense, so you get more value out of this health. And that is why 2 items that were buffed with Season 8 have gained insane popularity, Shift's Shield and Encile. They may have a little bit of stat bloat at the moment anyways, but it's so easy to opt into these 2 choices, then one flat pen item, like let it be a Brawler's Beatstick most of the time, and Bumba's Hammer. And that's your build. Then you have power boots along with that and some filler at the end, maybe a Heartseeker or something if you're lucky. And for most characters, this will be the most effective build. Obviously there are situations where you, for example, want to trade out your Encile for Winged Blade, or you want to fit in an Aaaand or something, or you don't need one of the defensive choices, but the vast majority of games will not be lost to your build if you're building these items. And we're seeing this even in the competitive scene, in the SCC, the next level under the SPL. Pretty much every jungler has been going into Bumba's Hammer. The reason is simple. Yeah, your early game is a little bit weaker, but most games at the moment easily go long enough to reach the point of the game where you can upgrade your starter. And the moment you can upgrade your starter, Bumba's Hammer is the best option. It will outtrade even Protector of the Jungle, and it will be better in any situation where you are defending, for example, where you're not in the jungle. It'll be better for sieging objectives. It just has so many perks in so many ways. And it's not necessarily just because Bumba's Hammer is overpowered, but also because other options are severely underpowered or just weird. And I think the fact that this so heavily encourages defense-focused builds is extremely boring. I personally love bruiser builds in jungle, but not like this. I like it when you choose specific counters, defensive options that make sense for the situation, but not if you put down the cookie cutter defensive items every single game because you know they are going to work. Encile is a little bit more situational because sometimes the effect will be procced in bad ways by the enemies so you can't utilize it well, but even that is rare nowadays. Often it will be enough just to keep away the tank. So I really want to see an overhaul to the jungle items in many ways. I think it would actually be better if Mannequins becomes an ability focused option more in the direction of Bluestone for junglers specifically, so that that item can be utilized effectively by a lot more characters and gives us an aggressive choice for ability-based junglers. So then those can capitalize heavily off a very strong early game and maybe have some weaker upgrades afterwards in order to offset the fact that there will be so many slow, careful, protective builds that opt into sustain through Bumba's Hammer in late game. I genuinely think that the SPL will be relatively boring as long as we are in a Bumba's meta where most junglers will focus on farming. I hope I'm proven wrong there and they pull out some really weird strategies, but so far I'm not too hopeful just yet. As for balancing Bumba's Hammer, I think this item needs an internal cooldown either per ability or after a set amount of abilities. So say this can proc 3-4 times in a row, but then it needs a break, because that will stop it from being abused so much by certain very specific characters, while others don't utilize it as well, and will make it way less overwhelming in general, and then they can look at balance of the other stats of the item. So I really hope that Hi-Rez looks into all of this as soon as possible. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe, or I will go. Thanks to my patrons for making this video possible. That includes That Nick Walker, Donald Dryden, Melancholy Gengar, Dwayne, Brennan, Lanta 25 Green, Zed, The Undead, Nevitz Jr., Raw Wars, and everyone else listed here.